The year is 1241. Europe is facing one of its darkest nights. A storm rolling in from the east is sweeping the largest land army the world has ever seen westward. This army belongs to the grandsons of Genghis Khan. They are the Mongols, and their destination, the heart of Europe. But then something happened. The great Khan died. The Mongol generals turned their horses around. Europe was saved at the very last second. But what if it wasn't? What if those generals never said, "Hold on," and instead rode full speed all the way to Lisbon? That's what we're talking about today. And fair warning, the ending of this story isn't as dark as you might think. In fact, it might be stranger than you ever imagined. First, let's rewind for a moment. Because if you're picturing the Mongols as wild hordes on horseback, you're seriously overdue for an update. Under Genghis Khan, and later his grandson Batu Khan, the Mongols had built the most organized military machine in history. Let's refresh your memory. They took China, they swept through Central Asia, they crushed Iran, Iraq, and the Caucasus. They won the Battle of Legnica in Poland, and they marched into Hungary and shredded the Hungarian army like it was made of paper. By 1241, there was no serious force in Europe capable of stopping the Mongols. None. Full stop. Once you accept that fact, you can finally ask the real question. What would have happened if they kept going? Hungary has fallen. What's next? Vienna. In 1241, Vienna is no Renaissance city. It's a modest, walled town, serviceable by the standards of its time. When the Mongol cavalry rides in, the city can barely mount a resistance. Vienna falls. Then Central Europe opens up. The German principalities, a patchwork of small states constantly at war with each other. That fragmented structure isn't an obstacle for the Mongols. It's practically an open invitation. The Holy Roman Emperor at the time, Frederick II, is busy fighting both the Pope and his own barons. When a Mongol envoy shows up at his door, he's already juggling too many other problems. France is a different picture. King Louis IX is preoccupied with the Crusades. When the Mongols cross the Rhine and push into France, the first response might not be resistance at all. Maybe the logic of the enemy of my enemy cracks the door to negotiation. Italy gets even more interesting. The trading republics of Venice and Genoa were already doing business with the Mongols, and this really happened in history. These were pragmatic people. As the Mongols pushed south, Italian merchants might have been lining up to sit at the table. By the time we reach Spain, the picture changes color entirely. Because in southern Spain, there's Al-Andalus Muslim rule. The Mongols had already leveled Baghdad. So what would they do with the Islamic kingdoms of Iberia? We'll come back to that question in a moment. Here's where most people expect the story to go. The Mongols burn everything, destroy everything, and wipe the slate clean. But history tells a different story. The Mongols were ruthless during conquest. There's no denying that. But once the fighting was over, look at what they did in China. A century of stability. They revitalized the Silk Road. They built tax systems. They showed tolerance toward different religions. Historians call it the Pax Mongolica, the Mongol peace. It's entirely reasonable to expect the same in Europe. Europe's feudal structure was already crumbling. Petty lords, endless conflict between church and crown, peasants locked in serfdom. When the Mongols settled on top of all that, they would almost certainly have dismantled the feudal system. Is that a bad thing? For the peasants, maybe not. Trade routes? They would have exploded, a single empire stretching from China to Lisbon, one open road. What Marco Polo did, everyone would do. Knowledge, goods, and people would have flowed between Asia and Europe at a speed that would have seemed miraculous by the standards of the time. So here's the paradox. The Mongol invasion would have shattered Europe, and possibly carried it into the modern world far faster than it actually got there. So what happens to the Pope? In this era, the Pope isn't just a religious figure. He's a political power center. The Mongols didn't directly target the Church, as history shows. But the Church's political authority would have taken a serious hit. And here's where a fascinating alternative history unfolds. Under Mongol rule, Christianity, Islam, and Buddhism would have coexisted side by side. That's not hard to imagine, because the Mongols had already made it work across Asia. Would the Reformation have come early? Almost certainly, yes. Maybe in a very different form. Instead of Luther in 1517, maybe someone steps forward in 1350. Because the Church's grip on state power simply couldn't have survived under Mongol governance. Which means Europe might have shed its religious wars far earlier and arrived at a secular political structure centuries ahead of schedule. And now, we come to the biggest question of all. In 1492, Columbus discovered the Americas. So in this alternate timeline, who does it? If the Mongol Empire is still intact and ruling Europe, the dynamics that launched the Age of Discovery would look completely different. Spain and Portugal's voyages were driven largely by religious motivation and competitive nationalism. Under Mongol rule, neither of those forces would have existed in the same form. But exploration wouldn't stop entirely, because the drive to trade never goes away. Merchants under Mongol rule would have searched for an Atlantic route. Maybe this time, Chinese sailors reached the Americas first. And some historians actually argue this may have happened as early as 1421. So the Americas would still have been reached, just possibly by someone very different, and that someone might not have arrived with the mindset of enslaving and exterminating the indigenous peoples. That single difference would have changed the lives of millions. All right, let's bring it all together. If the Mongols had fully conquered Europe, and the Pax Mongolica had taken hold here too, we would probably be looking at something like this. First, nation-states might never have formed, or formed much later. Today's borders of France, Germany, and England would look completely different. Maybe one vast continental state, maybe a mosaic of small autonomous regions. Second, technology would likely have advanced faster. China's inventions, paper, gunpowder, the compass, would have spread to Europe far earlier and far more widely through Silk Road networks. The Industrial Revolution might have begun not in the 1800s, but in the 1500s. Third, colonialism as we know it might never have existed. A world of exploration led not by nationalistic Spain and Portugal, but by the multicultural Mongol trade network would have produced a very different kind of globalization. Fourth, for those of us in Anatolia and the Middle East, this scenario places us somewhere entirely different. The Mongols had already sacked Baghdad in 1258. That's real history. But the Anatolian Beyliks and the eventual rise of the Ottoman Empire might have played out completely differently without the context of Mongol pressure, or might never have happened at all. We've just picked apart one of history's greatest what-if questions. Here's the takeaway. The Mongol conquest wouldn't have erased Europe. It would have transformed it. And whether that transformation would have produced a better world or a worse one, we genuinely can't say. But here's what we do know. If those riders hadn't turned back in 1241, you might be watching this video in a different language today. You might be living in a different country. You might not exist at all. History sometimes turns on a single rider. If you enjoyed this video, stick around. Next time, we're chasing down another what if that will keep you up at night. Drop your scenario ideas in the comments. Your question just might become the next episode. See you then.